She woke up and could remember everyone in her life, except the one who had meant everything. The fluorescent lights hummed like distant rain. Lily's eyelids tasted of iron. Her mouth was a desert. A plastic band cinched her wrist. An IV needle pricked her skin like a question. When she blinked, faces pooled around the bed. Sophie with bleach blonde hair and worry in her smile, a hospital chaplain whose clipboard trembled, a nurse who kept checking the monitor as if the beeping was a truth to be negotiated. "Lily," Sophie said, too loud for the quiet. "Hey, you're okay. You're awake." Lily tried to put together where she was. The room felt both huge and impossibly close. Sterile curtains, the smell of antiseptic that scrubbed at the edges of memory. She knew Sophie. She could see her sister's freckles, the tiny worried crease at the corner of her mouth when she lied about being brave. Faces came to her like stitched fragments of a quilt. "When did this happen?" Lily asked. Her voice was a scratch. "How long?" "You were in an accident," Sophie answered, and the words landed with the weight of a hand on her chest. "A hit and run on the highway. You were found by the side of the road. They think you hit a guardrail. You've got a concussion." Lily's mind rifled for a name, the man who'd been everything. A 3-syllable name, soft in her mouth like a promise. Her tongue searched, met an unfamiliar blank. A slow, cold panic threaded its way up her spine. "Do you remember?" Sophie hesitated, then bridged the silence with gentleness. "Do you remember Miles?" Lily's face said nothing, and Sophie's smile cracked like glass. "Miles Williams, Mr. Williams' son. You two, you've been together, weren't you?" The question should have landed, either in the warm place of recognition or lukewarm disappointment. But the place where his name should have lived was empty, as if someone had taken an eraser to a corner of a painting. She could remember Sophie's favorite songs, the shade of paint in their old kitchen, 1,000 Faces at the design fair last year. She remembered Mr. Williams's boozy laugh at the Christmas party. She remembered the smell of wet pavement. She remembered being obsessed, but when she tried to conjure Miles, his laugh, the way his jacket always smelled like aftershave and rain, she met only a soft, bewildered fog. "You remember everyone except him," Sophie whispered. "Do you remember anything about the accident? Do you remember why you were on the highway? Were you with him?" Lily's eyes filled, but the tears were made of confusion, not sorrow. How do you grieve a man you cannot call up? Her memory offered photographs, long stretches of pursuit that now read like a one-sided story. She could see herself chasing. She could see a rain-silvered night where headlights were smeared into streaks of light and the world tilted. She could feel the cold of abandonment more than she could see the face that caused it. The image of being left on the shoulder of a slick highway was vivid enough to bruise. A pair of taillights disappearing like a period at the end of a sentence. "He left me on the highway," she said before she could stop herself. The words belonged to a memory she hadn't been able to pull into place yet, but it felt honest. It felt like the outline of a truth. Sophie's lips tightened. "For Grace," Sophie said. The name was a blade. He ran back to her when she came back into town. Grace. The syllable was sharp. Sophie's mouth held it wrong. Lily tried to imagine her. Graceful as her name, perhaps. Tall, everything neat and wound. Someone who returned to him and fit. The feeling that rolled through Lily at that moment was ugly and hot and foreign. Rage for a woman she'd never actually seen. Yet it sat like an ember no matter how she tried to blow it away. "You don't remember him at all?" Dr. Patel, the neurologist, asked as he leaned over the chart. His hairline was a tired arc. "Selective amnesia can happen after a concussion. Sometimes it takes one relationship, one traumatic bond, and the brain erases it as a kind of protection. It's not permanent in every case, but you should be careful. Seizures, emotional triggers." "We'll take it slow," Sophie cut in, protective. "She doesn't need a barrage of faces or—" Her voice hardened into a shield. "She needs time." Inside Lily, time felt like a collapsed thing. She had pieces of a life threaded through her. Design boards stacked like memory altars, Emails with notes in a Alice blue font she always used to write to clients. A drawer full of fabric swatches she could identify by touch. She could see in one flash the front of their old apartment, a little balcony with a plant she'd killed 2 summers in a row. She could hum the jingle of the coffee shop down the block. But the person whose absence had made those things ache, who had been the center of a 7-year orbit, was missing. "Do you remember why you were so obsessed with him?" Sophie asked, a question that tasted like both accusation and tenderness. Obsession. The word landed in Lily's chest like a stone. She could remember in scraps, states of mind, nights she lay awake composing messages and then deleting them, the way she would design a dress with him in mind, imagining him wearing a suit and smiling at the hemline. She'd built an entire interior life around answering one man. Even if she could not summon the man, she could feel the gravity she had given him. Sophie squeezed her hand. "You deserve someone who sees you," she said. "Not someone who leaves." Those words, simple as they were, stung with truth. Lily wanted to believe them. She wanted, with all the ferocity of someone who had once arranged her world around another's shadow, to believe she could be more than a footnote in someone else's story. For days after she was discharged, her world narrowed to small, manageable things. Her apartment smelled faintly of rain even on dry days. People sent flowers with cards that said things like, "Get well soon," from colleagues at the studio. Her phone buzzed with messages, some gentle, others clinical, and a few that were raw with curiosity. Among them were texts from Sophie and from a handful of coworkers, advice, links to neurologists, and one cryptic voicemail from a woman named Mara, her editor, who had left a message heavy with the exhaust of politics. "Lily, this whole thing, there's talk. Don't engage yet. Take it slow. You can come back when you're ready," Mara had said. "The board is messy right now. Grace is present." The name again. Present. Like a shadow cast across her inbox. Lily's fingers tightened around a fabric swatch proffered by a concerned colleague during a visit. A pale, neutral linen that somehow smelled faintly of a perfume she couldn't name. It became an anchor. She would touch it when the world tilted. Sophie moved in, insisting on order and rendering the apartment into a staged version of normal so Lily wouldn't have to think. She placed a small sachet of lavender in the bedside table, a silly, sentimental thing that made Lily smile when she smelled it. A comb lay beside the tissue box, its teeth worn from use. Sophie had tucked that comb into Lily's hand the night before Lily's discharge and said, "Keep this. You'll need it." That comb would later become an image she would come back to, a talisman she didn't yet know to treasure. The city had not been kind in those weeks. News cycles chewed on the story of the accident. Was it random? An act of violence? Gossip gave it teeth, and the teeth bit into her like anything else. Subscribers, followers, a rogue thread about a romantic scandal between a young designer and an heir. People loved a narrative. People loved a fall. When she was finally coaxed back to work, a gentle, tentative gesture, Lily felt exposed. The studio smelled like the past. Her desk still held a mug with a cracked handle she had left on a deadline night. An unfinished project lay in a drawer, its layers of trace-marked fabric and sketched lines like fossils of an ambition. Her boss, a pragmatic man named Mr. Daniels, offered a nod and a file folder heavy with mail. He was sympathetic in the measured way executives were, which was to say he was more concerned about workflow than wounds. "We'll pace it," he said. "You tell us what you can do." The first time she saw Miles after the accident, it was from across a glass partition at a charity luncheon. She saw him because someone pointed, and because the world has a way of setting traps. He had not changed. Year announces itself on faces like lines, but Miles's face was a study in arrested time. Sharp jaw, the habit of leaning with his weight on the opposite leg, a jacket thrown like deliberate disinterest over an otherwise perfect turn. He moved with that casual arrogance talented men cultivate, the sort whose confidence says they have never had to work for attention. There was a woman at his side, warm smiles and hair that caught the light grace, exactly as Sophie had described, deliberate, polished, as if she had stepped out of a glossy photo shoot. Lily's heart gave the odd sensation of falling into a hole that did not have a bottom. But when she blinked, The whole was an absence. She felt the physical sensation of being watched by a past she could not name. Heat woke in her neck. Her hands clutched her coffee like a raft. Miles's shoulder brushed Grace's as if he belonged beside her. And for a moment a dull, oddly anonymous sense of betrayal washed through Lily, sharper for the lack of narrative about the man who'd caused it. How do you measure poison when you can't even name the source? Sophie watched the exchange with a quiet ferocity that suited her. She'd always been like that. Small, white-hot, a spare wheel that refused to be flattened. After that, rumors moved faster than any patient recovery. A staged fall at a pool party, Grace had been at the center of it, and people whispered about an accident that looked too clean to be true. Someone had dropped a video on Tuesday night, footage of Lily and Grace at the edge of a party pool, a moment of collision, a splash followed by the crowd's breathless silence. Lily remembered the pool as a smear of laughter and hard lights. Later, the clip would be edited to make it look as if Lily pushed Grace. The internet's hunger for villainy is immediate. By the time Lily walked into the office the next morning, the rumor had ossified into fact. Some journalists had framed the footage as proof of a jealous and dangerous young designer. The studio's inbox filled with polite and not-so-polite inquiries. A client withdrew a commission with a curt email. A sponsor froze an announcement. Sophie rushed to her side, fury tempered with frantic problem-solving. "They're twisting it," she said. "They're taking clips out of context. We'll have receipts." Receipts, paper, archive stamps, timestamps. Those were the tools of any decent defense. In the back room of the studio, Lily and a few allies huddled and dug through servers, hunting for raw files, unedited takes, pieces of the night that might prove there had been no shove, only an unfortunate tumble in a crowded space. At 2 a.m., with stale coffee and the hum of the server as a soundtrack, Lily found a folder of surveillance footage she didn't remember uploading. 3 raw angles from the night. On one, she saw herself through a lens that showed no intent. She saw bodies moving like tides, lights blinking, someone slipping, one. On another, at the moment some editor had slowed time and sharpened a face into malice, she instead watched Grace laugh, quiet, quick, and then move like an actress making sure she'd be framed correctly. "You can fight it," Mara had said over the phone, voice low. "We can mirror them. Evidence is a thing. But they'll hurt you, Lil. They'll make you the story." "Then we'll give them a better one," Sophie said. It felt like a vow. What the rumor couldn't account for was the deeper, quieter campaign already whispered behind closed doors. When Grace gained the attention of the company patriarch, Mr. Williams, doors opened that had been stubbornly closed to Lily. Mr. Williams had a habit of favoring faces that reflected his own vanity. Grace fit like a mirror. Lily had always been the designer who stayed late and stared at technical details until they became beautiful. She had the talent. Grace had the pedigree. In corporate arenas, pedigree counts as a kind of armor. That March, a small meeting was called in the boardroom. Lily sat rigid at the long table. The lights hummed. Mr. Williams arrived wearing a silk tie that smelled faintly of cigar smoke and old money. He smiled in that way men of his position smiled. Broad, practiced, like a curtain pulled to conceal something. "We're restructuring the collaboration model," he said, voice smooth and sleepy. "We're bringing in some advisors, fresh blood, new faces." Fresh blood, Lily thought, translated, parachute hire for Grace. She felt the table shift beneath her. A paper slid toward her, a memo about strategic partnerships and the value of brand alignment. Her name appeared in the header alongside a list that suggested she would be consulted, not coronated. "Lily's work is valuable," Mr. Daniels said, and his tone tried for middle ground. "She's coming back from a serious injury." "You're right, Daniel," Mr. Williams said, "which is why a steady hand is necessary. We'll need someone who understands the family's vision. We'll bring Grace on a trial basis." Grace watched him with the patience of someone who had practiced waiting for a door to open. Her smile was an instrument. When she spoke, it was with the calibrated charm of a woman who'd been taught the right pitch for every room. "Of course," she said. "I'd be honored." It was all arranged like a choreography where Lily had been given no part. She sat very still. She wanted to be angry, She wanted to shout that she had bled for her designs, that she had stayed up nights sketching until the dawn, that her fingerprints were smudged into the fibers of everything she had created for the studio. But the words lodged in the hollow she'd been given by the accident and simply wouldn't take shape. Back at her desk, a draft lay open on her screen. Fabric-cut lines, a silhouette annotated in neat handwriting she recognized as her own. Someone had rearranged the files to make it look as if Grace's name appeared in the metadata first. Someone had made an edit that suggested that the inspiration for the entire line came from a research trip Grace had never taken. When Lily checked the timestamps, there was a clean smile of manipulation. The file modifications pointed to a pristine sequence that implicated her, suggested her designs were derivative, or even stolen. "You must report it," Sophie urged. "It's forgery. Malpractice." Lily felt the edges of anger, then the dull ache of fatigue. "If I report it," she said, "it will be my word against a network, against Mr. Williams's son, against their reach." "Then prepare the receipts," Sophie said. "We will timestamp everything. We will show the drafts. We will show the process." There is a brand of humiliation that comes from being taken apart in public and having the parts displayed under fluorescent lights. Lily felt it the day the industry gala became a tribunal. The hall had been arranged with the kind of chilly opulence that made people feel both smaller and more admired, all at once. Mirrored columns, crystal lights, platters of food. Cameras flashed like small suns. The night was supposed to be a celebration. For Lily, it was a battlefield. It started with a whisper. A journalist leaned over, voice conspiratorial. "Is it true? They say you pushed Grace by the pool?" Another clip surfaced that someone had edited to amplify the fall. Conversations in the foyer congealed into headlines. By the time she walked the red-carpeted entry, she could feel the crowd's eyes like a tide. She smiled stiffly because every good kid in the industry knows the trade. You smile, you buy time. You don't let panic be a smudge in a picture. Grace was resplendent. Miles stood just behind her, a shadow that still pricked at something unnamed in Lily's chest. He spoke in a tone that suggested neutrality, but his eyes were a small, useless storm. When the awards were announced, Lily's name was called for a category she'd dreamed about. She rose to applause that sounded like a thin curtain of noise. As she accepted the envelope, a projector behind the stage began to play a montage, an image sequence meant to be a tribute. The lights glared, the montage flickered, and then, to everyone's startled silence, a clip aired. The pool footage, edited, slowed, the exact frame that made Lily look like she had instigated harm. Gasps moved through the room, the applause thinned, turned into the rustle of a giant shifting its weight. Her mouth dried, her hands trembled. She could feel the room retracting from her. In that instant, the world narrowed to a single, impossible choice. Fight, and be the center of a storm that promised to rip her to pieces, or leave, disappear, nurse the wound until whatever was left of her could grow again. She did not speak. She walked off the stage with the envelope clutched to her chest. Sophie was at the edge of the backstage like a guardian angel with bruised wings. "We'll get the footage," she said, voice fierce. "There are raw files. We'll show them. Don't let them write your story." But the headlines had already been drafted in advance. By morning, the press had rendered the montage as evidence. Sponsors hesitated. The board sent a gentle note asking her to take a leave of absence while they investigated matters. Those words, investigated matters, are the kind men use to politely excise inconvenient talent. "I'm not taking leave," Lily told Mr. Daniels when he called, his voice squeezed into caution. "I won't be pushed out because someone decided to rewrite a night." "Lily," he said, patient and restrained, "it's not just about you. The company needs stability. There are stakeholders." "You need to stand by me," she said, the plea a hot thing in her throat. He hesitated. "I can't make that call alone." His voice was the voice of someone tasked with weighing human cost in corporate balance sheets. Isolation is a peculiar thing when it blooms in a crowded room. Lily felt the architecture of her life shifting, planks removed without sound. She had built a path. Now there were gaps where once there had been steady steps. At the end of the week, she sat alone in her apartment, the comb Sophie had given her lying beside a half-filled glass of wine. The city outside moved on, indifferent to the particular ways lives crumple and then smooth. Her inbox filled with supportive notes and constructive suggestions about taking the high road. Her fingers hovered over a resignation letter she had begun to draft. Short, formal, a document that could draw a line under a career if necessity demanded it. At 2 a.m., Sophie found her at the kitchen table, blinking under the light like someone who had forgotten how to hold herself upright. "They want you to leave," Sophie said. "Grace is being floated as a consultant. They need someone they can control." "They've been controlling me for 7 years," Lily murmured. The words tumbled out like a confession. She thought of the nights she had stayed up, rewriting emails before sending them, calibrating the pitch of her voice so that it would land just right in Miles's ear. She thought of the hours she had spent leaning over patterns until her back ached. She had given everything to a version of herself that was designed to please a man who had always kept his distance. In the absence of a face, the distance had become all the clearer. The obsession that had once felt like love now looked like labor paid into a vault that had refused to open. Sophie placed a hand on her shoulder, fierce in a way that made Lily's breath hitch. "You don't have to stay and be eaten," Sophie said. "You can leave. You can start somewhere that values you. Leave." The word felt like a key turned in a lock. She could see dimly a new life composed of different choices. She could be someone's supportive studio lead, or start her own label, or even, daringly, refuse to spend a lifetime waiting for recognition that left bitter tastes. There was panic beneath the idea. To leave was to admit defeat, to let them write the closing chapter. There was also a strange relief, a chance to reclaim the narrative. She closed her laptop and took up the resignation letter again. Her hand did not shake when she signed it. It was a small act of possession. She folded the paper into an envelope, slid it into her bag, and felt, suddenly and unreasonably, lighter for the small, decisive action. The next morning she walked into the studio with the envelope tucked like a dare. The office smelled like unresolved business and cold brew coffee. People paused, looked up. Grace passed like a figure out of a magazine and offered a nod that might have been sympathetic if she had not been so perfectly poised. Miles was not there. Rumor had it he was in Europe, an ambiguous itinerary that fed tabloids and left less room for actual facts. "Are you sure?" Mr. Daniels asked, throat tight. "We can get legal to step in, we can—" "You can and you will," Lily said. "But I can't be a poster child for someone else's narrative. I made choices that led me here, and I'm making another choice now." She slid her letter across the desk. The air in the room hummed as if the building itself had held its breath. Mr. Daniels picked up the envelope like someone opening an artifact. He gave a look that suggested he approved, and did not approve at the same time. The tragic look of the bureaucrat who must accept the human cost. "You don't have to run," he said. "Running," she said, "is a strong word for leaving a room where I'm being accused of things I didn't do. I call it moving." Sophie clapped her hand over Lily's, a small, almost imperceptible benediction. "You made a brave choice," she whispered. If one could script a life like an edited montage, quitting would be a cinematic moment. A slow pan out as the protagonist walks away and the credits roll. Reality is less generous. The resignation made waves, but it did not erase the sound of the crowd. The studio filed her letter with the same indifferent efficiency they filed everything. The press smelled blood and circled. A small, nasty rumor blossomed that she had left because she could not survive scrutiny, that the industry had rejected her. Strangers sent messages that read like confessions. "I don't think you deserved it." Others were carved with accusation. The digital world amped a whisper into a howl. She took her few things, an old chair, a stack of sketches, and the comb Sophie had tucked into her bag, into a cab, and felt a sense of being on a threshold. At the edge of the city, rain began to fall, tapping at the cab's roof in a pattern that felt, when she let it, like punctuation. Her phone buzzed with a name she still didn't remember and a single message. "I'm sorry." The sender's name read as something familiar and foreign. Miles Williams. She wiped the rain from the window and read the message twice. There was no time for closure, no room for the tidy bars of a neat emotional resolution. At the corner of the cab window, a single droplet slid and traced a path like a small comet. Lily folded her hands around the comb in her bag and felt its smooth, worn teeth. She had no idea the comb would become a key, or that a sachet hidden in a coat pocket months from now would trigger a memory she'd been missing. She only knew this. A road had opened beneath her feet, slick with rain, and she had chosen to step into it. If this story has pulled you in and you want to follow Lily as she fights to reclaim her voice, her craft, and her dignity, subscribe and stay with her. There's more to come. She left the city that week with 2 suitcases and a head full of incomplete sentences. The skyline folded behind her like a hand closing. Sophie stayed with her for the first few nights in a hotel where everything was too new and too neat. They ate takeout in the lukewarm glow of a TV that showed nothing but headlines. Miles's name appeared like an unwelcome refrain in the background of their conversations. Sophie, pragmatic and fierce, suggested legal counsel, a clean slate somewhere else, and a list of contacts who owed favors. "We can start from zero," Sophie said, and it sounded like a promise and a threat. "No one knows you there. You can make the work speak." Lily wanted to believe it. She wanted to rebuild entirely apart from the broken bones of the past. In the quiet between the noise, she began to draw again. It was clumsy at first, lines that didn't connect, silhouettes that felt like tentative experiments. She bought a new sketchbook and a cheap set of colored pencils. The first time she pressed a mark into the paper, something like a shuttered room inside her budded open. She used motifs she loved. Rain, turned from a scene of abandonment into a textured fabric print. Comb teeth as repeated pattern. The soft geometry of a city at dusk. Her hands remembered what memory could not. The pressure to pull line through fabric. The rhythm of a hem. The work felt honest in a way that gossip could not touch. On the second week away, she received an email that felt like a lifeline, an introduction to a boutique firm in a smaller city, Grant & Co., from a friend who owed a favor. The email read like an offer to breathe. "We need someone with your sensibility. Come meet us. Apply." It was the sort of thing that might have been offered years earlier, if the right person had known to look. Felix Grant's name appeared on the email, as if by chance. The company, she learned, was helmed by a man who preferred to find talent that wasn't already polished for the spotlight. The job was modest at first, a consultant role to redress a troubled line and help anchor the brand's creative direction. It promised something she'd craved without realizing, a place where skill mattered more than who you were linked to. When she walked into the Grant offices for the first interview, the place smelled like wood polish and coffee, and the layout was simple and warm. Open desks, plants that trailed toward the light, an absence of glass partitions that implied faith rather than hierarchy. Felix met her in a lobby that felt like a living room, wearing a sweater that looked thrifted in a way that suggested taste rather than thrift. "You must be Lily," he said, voice even and welcoming. He had a way of speaking that did not demand to be heard. He listened as she described her work, as if each sentence he received was a small gift he was careful not to drop. When she spoke of the gala, of the montage, he did not blink and say the expected things. He simply asked questions that were precise and not prying. "We don't care about gossip," he said. "We care about process. Show me the designs you believe in." She did. He sat across from her and named the elements he loved with that quiet specificity that makes someone feel seen. The way she handled negative space, the risk she took with texture. He asked her about sources of inspiration, and when she mentioned the rain, he nodded. "There's a melancholy in rain that can be so rich," he said. "There's also a hard, honest beauty. We like that." There was no heroism in his admiration. There was instead an offer of steady recognition. He didn't promise fireworks. He promised a table where the work could be laid bare and not eaten by gossip. Someone else would decide whether the job would pay well, whether the firm could elevate her profile. But in the quiet of that conversation, an ember of trust, that small human currency, did begin to glow. When she left Grant's office that afternoon, the rain had started again, small and persistent. Lily stood under the awning and watched it fall. For the first time since the accident, the rain felt less like a wound and more like a texture with its own beauty. Perhaps it was the novelty of a new place, Perhaps it was the fatigue of a collapse she hadn't yet named. Or maybe it was simply that someone had looked at her work and described it back to her without adding a backstory. She took the job the following week. The months that followed were a steady, stubborn stitch. The work at Grant was collaborative, and the firm's culture prized craft over headline. Felix introduced her to a clean, quiet rhythm, morning meetings, design critiques delivered with humor and clarity, a respect for deadlines and for the people who met them. She often stayed late not because she was trying to prove anything to anyone, but because she wanted to be near the work. Word drifted back to her like a slow fog of what-ifs. Miles's decline whispered in industry corridors. Someone had seen him at a dinner with a drink in his hand, and a look that was more empty than sorrowful. Grace's presence at Mr. Williams's side continued to complicate the skyline of gossip. The studio Lily had left carried on with a new face in the forefront, and the world, as always, found new names to chant. There were moments of quiet triumph. A small feature in a local magazine that praised the new line as honest, raw, and refreshingly tender. A boutique in the neighboring town placed an order for Lily's prints. She began to dream in color again, painting fabrics with the kinds of risks that had once seemed reckless and now felt like the first breaths of a life not choreographed by another person. But the past never quite left the perimeter of her life. It lingered in the messages that floated through her inbox, in the way cameras sometimes found her at industry mixers and framed her face in a way that suggested curiosity rather than respect. And then there were nights when the comb on her dressing table would catch the light, and she'd feel the ghost of a hand she could not remember. The world, mercifully, did allow small mercies. Days when she could lose herself in the grain of a fabric, when a line came together and the draft felt like prophecy. She learned to move through the city without flinching when she passed a familiar restaurant or saw a suit she associated, mistakenly, with the life she had lost. She began to write new messages to herself in the margins of her sketchbooks. You are more than a story someone else tells about you. You are your work. And yet somewhere under the new rhythm, there was a slow current pulling toward a question she could not yet answer. What would happen if the missing piece returned? Would she be grateful? Furious? Would she step back onto a bridge she had already burned? Or would she finally understand that a life once built in someone else's shadow can be returned to the light only by the work of one's hands? Would the man who had left her in the rain find the right words when he came back? Or would he only offer the too late weight of regret? The answers were a horizon she could not see from here. For now she had work, a small, stubborn team that believed in the creative act, and a new city that smelled like possibilities. She had also, in the back corner of a drawer, a sachet Sophie had given her, and the comb that had traveled with her through the nights. They were small anchors. She did not know yet that one day a smell, a touch, or a sound would stitch the missing memory back into her skull like a stubborn seam. She did not know that her life would swing back toward the man who had once chosen someone else on a rainy highway. She didn't know because some stories take time to show themselves. For now, she drew and sewed and stitched, slowly, deliberately, her name back onto the things she made. The months at Grant resembled a slow, deliberate mending. Work stitched the edges of Lily's life back together, not with flashy, immediate fixes, but with the patient, ordinary movements of craft, tracing a seam, testing a dye, standing beneath a light until the right shadow revealed itself. The studio smelled of coffee and sawdust and a kind of domestic optimism that made her forget sometimes the way the city had spat her out. Felix was there in the margins of those days, arriving early, leaving late, offering a quiet eye that watched her work without wanting to own it. Their relationship did not erupt into a headline. It grew in incremental, reassuring gestures. He brought over a thermos of tea one evening when she had been at her table so long she'd begun to feel like one of the prototypes. He offered notes in meetings that hurt no one and helped everyone. When an investor pushed a petty aesthetic preference, Felix spoke for the craft, and did it with enough tact that the room did not notice it was being swayed. He defended her publicly, his voice steady and factual, never performative, and privately, he listened in a way that made Lily feel like her sentences landed exactly where they were supposed to. There came a night when they closed the doors, and the studio hummed in the low, satisfied way of places that had done honest work. It was raining, a soft, domestic kind of rain that pelted the windows in tiny applause. Felix handed her a small package, a thrifted comb, its teeth worn smooth. He had found it in a market and thought the shape reminded him of something she once sketched. "For luck," he said, the corners of his mouth lifting without fuss. When Lily ran the comb through her hair, something in the motion, an echo of a hand she didn't remember, pricked at the surface of her mind. It was a faint thing, a ripple that left an aftertaste of iron and pavement. She tugged the memory aside and focused on the design spread in front of her. Felix didn't press. He handed her a mug and said, "We'll hang these up. Tonight we celebrate the lines that survived." The lines did more than survive. A quiet feature in a respected magazine began to rebuild the scaffolding of Lily's reputation. Orders came from boutiques that appreciated the honesty in her prints. At Grant, she was given the freedom to experiment, and with permission came confidence. She tested a print that used rain not as a wound, but as pattern, strata of grays and ink that suggested persistence rather than heartbreak. The design sold out in small, urgent batches. Positive reviews arrived in notes that refused sensationalism. "Lily Smith's new collection is clean, stubbornly tender," one editor wrote. The words felt like ballast. News from the old city came in uneven pulses. Miles drifted from press to rumor, seen at bars, slipping from parties with a flask inside a coat. Sophie, who had stayed but watched, would scroll with a kind of protective rage and hand the phone to Lily to confirm what the internet guessed at already. "He looks smaller in those pictures," Sophie said once, as if size could be measured in soul. "That look on him. It's like someone switched his outline." "If he's shrinking," Lily said, "let him." The cruelty in that sentence surprised her, but it was a cruelty measured as survival. When a message arrived from his number, short, inefficient, "I'm sorry," she read it and then closed the phone. Felix asked if she wanted to reply. She did not. Her life had been cataloged in apologies before. She wanted not apologies, but changed behaviors, which she suspected were not forthcoming. Grace, meanwhile, had not been idle. In the months after Lily left, rumors had circled like scavengers, and Grace had capitalized. She had friends where Lily had enemies, connections who took pictures that made narrative sense, and journalists who preferred an easy villain. But people also make mistakes. Charisma, it turned out, did not armor you against clever, patient work. An audit began quietly. A junior analyst at Lily's old studio, someone Lily had once helped over a tight deadline, had kept a copy of raw footage. He had not released it at first. He watched the way a story could be weaponized. But as the months wore on and Grace's influence crept into corporate appointments, the analyst grew uneasy. He sent the files to Mara, who had never lost the professional sourness of someone hardened by newsroom politics. Mara forwarded them to Sophie, and Sophie, who had been methodically collecting timestamps and drafts with the ferocity of someone building a case, sat awake that night and combed through every frame. What they found was not a single smoking gun but a pattern. Edits made on a company server, metadata adjusted and re-recorded. Emails with odd subject lines that suggested coordination, not accident. A chain of messages from an editor who had been promised exclusives in the famous journalist vein. The raw pool footage showed nothing decisive, only bodies and light and the unfortunate tumble. But other files showed that the montage aired at the gala had been reworked, frames slowed and cropped, certain expressions emphasized and then looped. More damning were the internal logs. An account had logged in from an IP address associated with a concierge machine at Mr. Williams's estate. The editing was traced back to a contractor who'd been paid with a code name. When the trails led to emails sent from Grace's account and sudden file ownership changes that favored a neat narrative, the Lily pushes Grace version, the story stopped being plausible and started being prosecutable. Felix, when Sophie reached out, offered Grant's resources. The firm had in-house counsel and a mild obsession with detail that bordered on holiness. Together they compiled a packet: raw footage, server logs, timestamps, invoices, and the contractor's purchase orders. It read like a ledger of intent. When a legal team who had previously declined to take Lily's case saw the stack, they blinked and agreed to act. Evidence has a peculiar gravity on its own. Once stacked, the apparent innocence of manufactured narratives began to wobble. For Grace, the wobble became a fall. An internal review at Mr. Williams' company produced uncomfortable emails that suggested a coordinated effort to eclipse Lily's credibility. Mr. Williams tried to maintain distance. He leaned into statements about needing to preserve brand integrity. But his own memos bore a pattern of favoritism that made public relations people wince. The news cycle turned. Investigative pieces ran with the leak of the server logs. The public appetite for a rehabilitation story was real, and this time it favored the wronged woman. That winter, Grace found herself facing a class of accusations she had not expected in her carefully ordered life. Defamation, fraud, and conspiracy to damage a competitor's reputation. She was questioned by investigators, then by prosecutors. Depositions can feel punitive for people used to being the architects. Grace, who had once calibrated her expression for every camera, now sat in rooms lit by fluorescent pragmatism and answered questions that scraped at her professional veneer. There were hush payments and contracts to explain, and a contractor who testified that he had been told explicitly to shape the narrative. Mr. Williams's legal team scrambled to put distance between their brand and the mistakes of a favored consultant. In the weeks that followed, prosecutors filed charges. Grace was arrested. The headlines that once elevated her now flattened her into a cautionary tale. The triumph of the legal process was not cinematic. It was paper and patience and the slow grinding of forensic review. But it mattered. For Lily, each disclosed invoice, each admitted edit, was a small stitch toward vindication. The internet, fickle and hungry for a story that turned out well, inverted its appetite. Voices that had cheered Grace's arrival now muttered at the thought of an orchestrated campaign. Sponsors who had hovered over Grace's introductions retreated. Mr. Williams issued a statement that looked like damage control. Miles watched the last of it unravel from the edges. His decline was less newsworthy than the scandals that had fed it. No one wrote articles about the quiet of a man regretting. There was no drama in the small, private habits that ruin people. The late-night bottle hidden in a coat pocket. The calls he did not make to people who might have needed him. The way his speech stumbled when he tried to assemble a sincere sentence. Sophie saw him once at a private gathering where his face seemed to have been hollowed out by anxiety. She came home and told Lily how he had lifted a glass and then let it fall unanswered. "He's afraid," Sophie said. "Not of the public, of himself." Felix never spoke ill of Miles. He watched with an even, guarded sympathy that belonged more to someone who understood patterns than to someone who excused them. He offered Lily steadiness in the way of small currency. He picked up her mail when she was away, signed her name at the dry cleaner, learned to iron the shirts she liked for presentations. When Lily's memory returned, he did not flinch. He was part anchor and part witness. The return of memory came with a quiet violence. It did not arrive like a thunderclap or a dramatic montage, but as a tissue-thin sequence of sensory cues that, when stacked, became a map back to a wound. Lily was preparing for a midsummer showcase at Grant, an intimate event of industry contacts and carefully chosen buyers, and she was nervous in a way the months of recovery had not prepared her for. The night before the showing, she went through her bag for the comb Felix had given her and found the sachet Sophie had once tucked into her coat. She had forgotten it was there. It had migrated in some packing shuffle, a relic of a night that had felt like survival. When she opened it, the lavender inside mingled with another scent she had almost stopped smelling, the cold, metallic tang of rain hitting hot asphalt. The scent was a small, treacherous key. Images unspooled, a streak of headlights, the abrupt slam of a car door, a taillight receding in a ribbon of red, the way the rain smacked the windshield like small, urgent knocks. More precise came the memory of a hand, his hand, once already familiar but now recontextualized. It had been the hand that lifted and held a cigarette slightly away from his body in a gesture of casual detachment. It had been the hand that had remained folded in his pocket as she stood shivering on the shoulder of the highway. A single particular sound attached itself to the smell, the dull, remote click of a turn signal, then the most precise image. Miles turning away with an expression that was not cruelty so much as decisive absence. A kind of domestic calculation that preferred the safety of old comforts to the messy labor of choosing someone who had never fit into that neatness. The memory was not cinematic indulgence. It was a ledger, a list of small choices. He had stopped the car briefly, long enough for her to think there might be a conversation, then left. He had signaled intent elsewhere in the silent, tidy phraseology of a man reverting to a familiar script. The car had driven away, its taillights flattening into a line of red like an ellipsis. Her chest filled with air so sharp she bit it. She sat down hard on the floor and covered her mouth as if to keep a sob from escaping. Felix was in the kitchen, unpacking display labels. When he came to see if she was all right, she could not make the full sentences. She handed him the sachet and pointed to her face. He watched with a steadiness that had become his trademark. "You don't have to go through this alone," Felix said. His voice was small and certain. "I remember," Lily said. The words were simple and terrible. "I remember the smell, and I remember—" She stopped. Saying his name felt like flinging a raw wound into a public square. "I remember him leaving me." Felix did not flinch. He sat on the floor and took her hand, allowing her the moment of fracturing without filling it with platitudes. "Whatever you need to do," he said. "Whatever you choose, I'm here." Memory returned in phases after that, as if the mind was arranging itself to host a new occupant. Once the initial pain settled into a shape she could examine, Lily wanted evidence. She wanted the facts that would prevent any shadow of doubt. Sophie, who by now had become an inconveniently relentless investigator when it came to Grace in the old studio, offered the files she'd been saving like ammunition. They had kept copies of raw footage, server logs, and a folder of private messages between architects of the montage. Lily and Felix sat together at a table and watched the raw night unfold on a monitor. Lights flaring, bodies moving, no intentional shove. They slowed the footage, matched it to timestamps, and then, because the human impulse is rarely satisfied with memory alone, they played another clip, a surveillance feed from the highway exit. It showed a car pulling over, the flash of someone stepping out, the brief staggered scene of someone speaking across the passenger window. The light at the side of the highway threw shadows across faces in such a way that they were not flattering. The camera showed what memory sometimes softens. There was the brief sound of an argument, muffled, indistinct. Then Miles's car moved on. The angle offered no villainy in the cinematic sense, but it offered an incontrovertible sequence of movement. He stopped, the exchange happened, and then he left. The footage was not about guilt as a moral indictment. It was about choices in sequence. The prosecutor in Lily would have loved a smoking gun. The truth, it turned out, was a series of small acts that added up. When she finally called Miles, it was because she wanted to hear him explain in plain terms. He answered after 3 rings, and the voice on the line was thinner than the one she had imagined. He asked if she would meet him. She read his hesitance, the syllables of apology drilled into him by a public made of mirrors and editors, and the tongues of people who had been watching since before she could name herself. They met in an unremarkable cafe that smelled of espresso and commercial lemon cleaner. Sophie waited in the car. Felix had encouraged her to bring a witness. He did not think he had the right to be the one who could possibly sway her decision in a matter of the past. Miles sat with his hands wrapped around a cup. He looked like someone who had been surprised by the way life leaned. "Lily," he said, and then let the name slide like something fragile he feared would break. "I don't need you to tell me what happened to you," Lily said. She kept her voice even, a practiced cool. She had rehearsed this scene in her head in all kinds of dramatic forms, but the truth was simpler. She wanted him to take responsibility, not to make a theater of remorse. Miles's apology was earnest and clumsy. He told her about Grace, about the relief he had felt when someone familiar returned, about how fear of confrontation had driven him to a selfishness that he now saw in the hard light of consequences. He spoke of nights where regret was a shape on the ceiling and of bottles that told him what he already knew. "I was cowardly," he said. "I am sorry." "I don't hate you for being afraid," Lily said. "I hate that you chose comfort over me. I hate that for 7 years I built a life that fit around your absence." The words were not pitched to hurt for the sake of cruelty. They were a ledger of truth she owed herself. "What happened changed me. It taught me that love that asks you to erase yourself is not love at all." He tried then to ask for another chance, But Lily had learned by living that harboring a wound in hopes it will heal with time is not the same as choosing safety. She pictured the way he had turned back on the highway, the neatness of his decision. "I don't want another chance with you," she said. "I want a man who sees me and stays. It's that simple." Miles folded in on himself, a small human sorrow. He nodded as if the motion could help stitch something. "I understand," he said. His eyes, for once, were not seeking forgiveness, so much as accepting consequence. He walked away from the table with the slowness of someone who had been learning to carry regret like an afterweight. That was the moment Lily recognized that the work of reclaiming herself was not merely an external battle against gossip or manipulation. It was an internal reallocation of love. The memory had not returned to pull her back into the past. It had returned to give her language. She could now name what had been done: the leaving, the collapse, the slow erasure. Naming it made room for an alternative. Felix asked questions she welcomed and answered them without theatrics. He spoke of partnership, not the kind that rescues, but the kind that tends. "You chose to build," he told her once, while they were sanding a prototype frame in the warmth of the studio's low light. "You didn't need me to tell you to. I just wanted to be the person who helped when the building got heavy." His courtship was a pattern of attentions that made sense. He praised without hyperbole, supported without sounding like he was saving her, and stepped into messy administrative fights on her behalf, with a competence that did not belittle her. When the legal dust finally settled and Grace's charges moved forward, Felix stood beside Lily in the courtroom lobby with a quiet hand at the small of her back. He did not speak in florid terms about destiny. He offered presence, and that steadiness was, for Lily, more persuasive than 1,000 dramatic confessions. Grace's trial became the industry's ugly lesson. Witnesses testified about edits and payments. The contractor who had done the montage described receiving wire transfers and being promised anonymity. The court did not become a melodrama. No scathing final-page confession, no midnight reprieve. But the record was clear enough that the verdict landed with a gravity that matched the misconduct. Grace was convicted on charges related to the campaign of manipulation and defamation. She received a sentence that put distance between her and the glossy rooms she once favored. The news carried on a smaller circuit after that. Legal results are never the tidy resolutions you expect in scriptwriting. But for Lily, it confirmed what she had always quietly believed. Actions spoken in the language of influence have consequences. The industry, which loves to taste its own cruelty, had to reckon with the fact it had been complicit. Boards changed halves of their PR teams. A few columnists wrote pieces about narrative building and ethics. Sponsors, fickle as they are, shifted their dollars. Lily watched all of this from the quietly constructed piece of Grant. Her life was not a vindication parade. It was a steady building. Felix proposed on a rainy afternoon, not on the dramatic highway of memory, but in the small domestic way he had preferred. They were at the studio, tucked between bolts of fabric and a steaming mug, and he found a moment when her shoulders loosened in a way that suggested she felt safe. He did not get down on one knee in any grand place, not because he was without romantic impulse, but because he understood symbol. He took her hand and said, "I want to be the person who helps you build, not because I want to fix anything, but because I want to make something with you." She said yes in a way that was a seal, not a surrender. It was her decision, thought through with the clarity she had gained. She loved him because he had earned it in the everyday ways that do not make for magazine covers. When the engagement was announced, there were notes of congratulation and quiet, generous approval. Sophie cried with a sense of rightness. Mr. Daniels, who had remained in an uneasy middle ground, sent a terse but sincere note. Miles sent a message more akin to a benediction than a plea. "Be well," it said, and he followed with nothing else. The wedding was modest and private. Felix's family invited a small circle, and the day unfolded with the quiet ritual of people who know each other. Lily wore a dress that echoed her aesthetic, an understated silhouette with a small textural pattern of comb teeth embroidered in the hem, a private nod to the talisman that had accompanied her through the months of reinvention. Sophie clasped her hand as she walked down the aisle. The ceremony was indoors. The rain, a conspiratorial curtain at the windows, washing the glass in moving filigree, so that the memory of wet highways would not intrude. Instead, the rain became a soft, domestic presence, a percussion that lent the day a kind of clean punctuation. Miles did not attend. He sent a short, respectful note and a floral arrangement that read as, "Apology." Grace was absent by necessity. Mr. Williams did not come. Power has its embarrassments, and the patriarch's absence felt like a small, apt punctuation to a story about influence and vanity. Felix's family, practical, perceptive people, welcomed Lily with a tact that made her feel like a partner rather than an acquisition. At the reception, someone complimented a line in Lily's address, the way she had quietly made space for the team that had helped her. She raised a glass not to the past, but to the work of making things that deserved to be made. There was a moment, later that night, when Lily slipped outside to the back terrace and opened the small, worn comb from her bag, the same one Felix had found. She paired it with the sachet Sophie had kept and pressed the scent to her face. Memory had been returned, had been examined, and had been integrated. The comb and the sachet remained, not as instruments of grief, but as relics of a route she had taken. She did not need the past to be her governor. She kept it like a map, a reminder of how far she had walked and the agency she had reclaimed along the way. In the years that followed, Lily's life settled into a kind of professional and personal symmetry. She accepted an offer from Grant to become creative director on a line that allowed her name to be attached to pieces in a way the old studio had never afforded. Some of her early designs were purchased by retailers who had once spurned her. Her name, when it appeared in articles, was paired not with scandal, but with craft. Felix's path inside his family's operation shifted. The Grant Group valued his consistent stewardship, and he accepted a position that tied the family name more closely to the company's future. Lily married into a role that made her a partner in the truest sense. She was not simply the CEO's wife as a title, but the spouse of a man whose family business she helped shape through creativity and counsel. The title carried weight, public and symbolic, but for Lily the title that mattered most was the one she had earned: designer, director, decision-maker. Miles's arc curled into something quieter. He entered into a program that advised him in the business of living with the consequences of small acts. He did not become villainous in any cartoonish sense. He was a man who had been diminished by his unwillingness to risk discomfort. Occasionally they would receive sealed notes, short updates carried by mutual acquaintances, telling of his attempts at sobriety, his small, clumsy efforts at apology. Lily read them with a kind of neighborly relief. She felt for the man who had once been an axis in her life, but she no longer believed her heart had room for the old ache. Grace, the woman who had once been the axis of a scandal, was dealt with by the law as the law deals with the messy intersections of ambition and ethics. The sentence she received kept her from the glossy room she once favored and provided necessary distance. It was a hard lesson that influence, when misused, corrodes the user as much as the target. Lily felt no glee at Grace's downfall. Resentment is too cheap an emotion. But she did feel the quiet satisfaction of justice being served in a form that returned balance to a life that had been tilted. On a winter morning a year after the wedding, Lily stood in a boardroom at Grant and watched a presentation of a new line. The room hummed with the low electricity of people who cared about craft. Felix sat beside her, not as a savior figure, but as an equal. Mr. Williams's name appeared in a small headline on a tablet someone had left on the table, an aside to a past that had once felt larger than it deserved. Lily's phone petitioned her with news alerts and the small requiem of modern life. Sophie texted a string of heart emojis and then, "You did it." She had done it, in ways that were not spectacular. She had done it by toning down the drama and turning up the work. At the end of the presentation, when designers from other houses applauded and buyers sought her out, she felt the ease of a life built on labor and respect. In her pocket was the comb, polished by travel and time. In a drawer lay the sachet, contained and sweet, its scent a reminder of storms weathered. Later that evening, as they sat on the apartment balcony, the city lights low, rain an occasional whisper, Felix took her hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, voice small enough to be intimate. She looked at him, and at the way the warm light caught his eyes. For a long time she had held regret like an awkward guest. Now she measured it like an object lesson. "I regret some things," she said honestly. "I regret giving my currency away to someone who did not deserve it. But I do not regret the labor I have done to build a life. I'm proud of the ways I fought. I'm grateful for the people who stayed." He nodded. "Then we'll keep building," he said. Outside, rain began, a sound she had learned to accept as a texture rather than a verdict. The comb lay on the bedside table. The sachet breathed its small, steady scent. Lily no longer needed memory to dictate her life's arcs. She carried them as evidence of a path taken and a set of choices made. To leave a room where she was being eaten by rumor, to accept steady partnership, to demand respect in work and love. She had been left in the rain once. She had been broken by absence and then rebuilt by attention. The title people might hand her in gossip columns, CEO's wife, had a syllabic weight that felt almost incidental now. It was true in the literal sense. She was the wife of a man who had become a senior figure in a company whose name mattered. But the truer title she chose for herself was earned in smaller verbs. She was a maker, a leader, a woman who had reclaimed authorship of her life. At the end of the night, as she smoothed her hand over the comb and laid it beside the sachet, she felt a peace that was less about being owned by a title and more about belonging to herself. If Lily's story kept you with her through the storms and the small rebuildings, there are more quiet victories and similar journeys worth following. Watch the next story in the playlist for another tale of reinvention.